Hello. I'm now going to continue my summary of B.B. Price's book on medieval thought. We've now reached chapter 4, the return to Plato and Aristotle. Price's book was published in 1992 and provides us with a brief summary of various aspects of medieval thought. In today's video, I'm going to cover the first half of the chapter to talk about Plato and Aristotle in the Middle Ages and the medieval role of Platonic and Aristotelian doctrines, and then we'll finish off the chapter next week. In this first section, I'll talk about three ideas: the concept of authority, the textual presence of Plato and Aristotle, and medieval versions of the two thinkers. So let's start off with the concept of authority. Most intellectual movements have specific authoritative texts which permanently determine their scope. In the case of Platonism and Aristotelianism, these are obviously based on the two thinkers' respective texts. In the Middle Ages, scholars attached particular importance to Plato and Aristotle, whilst adhering to the classical view of philosophy's general cultural importance, and this led to a major influence on Western learning and culture. Medieval thinkers both exalted philosophy and thought of it as the handmaid of theology, a combination of ideas which presented real difficulties. As to the concept of authority, for most thinkers in the Middle Ages, Plato and Aristotle were the sources of philosophy, and their work contained almost everything of importance. There was little need to consider anyone else. But Christianity was a post-classical religion, and on many Christian issues, Plato and Aristotle provided no guidance. For example, what was the nature of the Trinity? Was Jesus more human than divine? Why were specific Christian rituals significant? Rather than devising their own answers to these questions based on Scripture, medieval scholars often tended to ask, what would Plato and Aristotle have said on a particular subject? Plato and Aristotle were the authorities, a key concept in the incorporation of classical philosophy into the interpretation of Scripture. Although writers in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages turned to pagan thinkers, they did so in different spirits. Thus, Tertullian in the 3rd century and Arnobius in the 4th only acknowledged the ideas of Plato and Aristotle grudgingly. By contrast, Augustine in the 4th century stated that when Christians came across philosophical ideas that were true and well accommodated to our faith, then they should adopt them and convert them for our use. There was no reason to fear them. And this was particularly true of the ideas of Plato, as far as Augustine was concerned. One useful distinction that's been made is that there were two concepts of authority in play here. One was that authority was something which was an inherited assessment of someone as an esteemed thinker for a particular cultural group, and the other one was that somebody was authoritative in a time-honored and timeless sense, and therefore their ideas could be applied to the present day. Thus, some medieval thinkers could take the ideas of pre-Christian thinkers as having a traditional reputation in their particular time period, but not having relevance at the present time, so therefore not being threatening. But others could take their ideas as relevant for the present age, and as those who believed that Christian ideas had to be discussed within the context of all authoritative ideas, then ancient sources could be used to address gaps in present-day thinking. The textual presence of Plato and Aristotle. In the Middle Ages, many of the texts attributed to Plato and Aristotle are now known not to be authentic. So they were pseudo-Platonic or pseudo-Aristotelian, but they were then part of the accepted corpus. What scholars did have was also often incomplete. In the early period, from Augustine to roughly Boethius, scholars appear to have only had access to Plato's Meno and Timaeus, and to some of Aristotle's works on logic. Only in the 11th and 12th centuries, so much later, were a broader range of texts available, translated from Greek or Arabic, as few Westerners could then read Greek. Over time, scholars also came to realize that there was no standard Greek text, and there was then a move to create standardized versions for better understanding. By the 13th and 14th centuries, discussions at the universities began to untangle some of the meanings of certain passages, as well as inflaming bitter intellectual disputes. Different scholars also became experts, specialized experts on particular areas of the work of Plato and Aristotle in metaphysics or natural philosophy, and so on. Confusions continued, however. Scholars were prisoners of the texts they had available. Translations might be faulty or incomplete. Only a truncated version of Plato's Timaeus even then was known. A lot of spurious works, riddled with Neoplatonic philosophy, were attributed to Aristotle. Only in the 20th century did extensive standard editions get published. Medieval versions of Plato and Aristotle. Initially, available texts of Plato were extremely limited, improving only after the fall of Constantinople in 1453 and the rescue of Greek manuscripts to the West. The Neoplatonic writings of Plotinus were available, however, and colored the interpretation of Plato. Although initially limited, Aristotle's works became far more readily available through two separate waves of translation from Greek and Arabic in the later Middle Ages, and the book provides lists of names of translators. There were translation centers by the mid-12th and 13th centuries, as far apart as Constantinople, Antioch, and Nicaea in the east, and then various centers in Italy, Sicily, Spain, and England. The medieval role of Platonic and Aristotelian doctrines. Initially, the motivation for translating Plato and Aristotle into Latin was spiritual anxiety, part intellectual curiosity. Latin Christians were both concerned by the challenge of pagan authorities and in awe of them as great authorities. Despite the religious element in the interest in Plato and Aristotle and the involvement of clerics in universities, the church itself didn't organize or foster research into the work of Plato and Aristotle. Philosophy was increasingly seen as a means of understanding everything and anything, however, in all areas of intellectual life, including both philosophy and theology. A plurality of views and a continuing discussion obtained. There was no one accepted interpretation. Individuals' interpretations of both classical and biblical texts were for a very long time regarded as important, but not determinative. So even though those who held chairs at prestigious universities had an advantage intellectually in terms of presenting their ideas, there was no one single monopoly. So let's talk for a moment about the separate impact of the two thinkers. First, Platonic inspiration. Although little of Plato's work was initially available, Augustine's enthusiastic support for him and representation of his ideas were very influential. But the Christian uptake of Plato was selective. Various of Plato's ideas were interpreted to fit in with Christian thinking. Plato's great emphasis on the need to transcend the material world, with the immaterial world having priority over the natural one, was seen as being very Christian. Some medieval Platonists even took an almost Gnostic position and rejected the material world altogether. Then Plato's theory of ideas was creatively interpreted in a monotheistic context. Following Augustine, the images were seen as being within the divine mind, or Christ the Word. Again, Platonism explained causality and taught a hierarchy of being, which could be fitted in with Genesis. Then, following Boethius, universals were seen as real, separate entities. Finally, Platonists tended to see the soul as the mediator between the material body and the spiritual world. So all of these ideas fitted in with Christianity. In addition, there is the acceptance of mathematics as a means of studying eternal, immutable truths, and then a significant change from Plato, with Augustine arguing that divine illumination of the human mind was the source of human knowledge, not the soul remembering ideas from a previous state of existence. Aristotelian ideas. By the early 13th century, about 55 different works of Aristotle were available to study in Latin, and Price provides a list of those. Despite ecclesiastical prohibitions, there was enormous enthusiasm for understanding his work. There was no single interpretation, however, that was dominant. Universities became the locus for contentious disagreements about what Aristotle had written. Few scholars at that time knew Arabic or Greek, and therefore Aristotle was studied in Latin translation. But scholars did become aware of the importance of Arabic texts and the mediating role of the Muslim world in transmitting Aristotle's ideas to the Christian West. A few men even learned Arabic, and their translations were not confined simply to Aristotle, but to major Muslim interpreters of Aristotle, notably Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, and Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes. And as a result, Islamic interpretations of Aristotle became influential. Since the 12th century, philosophy had acquired a high status in European universities, and the new Islamic learning fitted in with Aristotle's classification of knowledge, with 13th century interest in Islamic philosophy, alchemy, mathematics, and medicine. Scholasticism was a particular and very important development. This was the methodological school of university scholars who sought to understand Aristotle by approaching texts through the aid of previous thinkers. Commentaries and glosses had long since become acceptable, and the texts of Aristotle were interlaced with commentaries and further exegesis. Aristotle's works permanently altered the scope of university education. They were enthusiastically incorporated into the curriculum. 6 of his works on logic were now available, elevating the role of dialectic above the arts of grammar and rhetoric. The abundance of works on natural philosophy from Aristotle also transformed the prestige and scope of the quadrivium, with the rise of terrestrial and celestial physics and of biology, whilst the so-called middle sciences, between physical and mathematical sciences, expanded to include optics, mechanics, and perspective, in addition to existing interests in astronomy and music. Ethics and metaphysics also became subjects in their own right. The liberal arts education became a preparation for courses in the arts and sciences. Aristotle's posterior analytics set out 2 tools which became essential to the practice of medieval science. One of these was induction and deduction as complementary methods of analysis, and the second was the demonstrative syllogism. Interest in Aristotle increased the importance of empirical observation in all areas of learning, especially the sciences, so observation became vital to epistemology. But for strict Aristotelians, Aristotle's analysis of objects as composed of qualitative and quantitative properties limited the use of mathematics to only the quantitative properties of things, their spatial dimension and number. Aristotle's physics was influential, but aroused major controversy, the first of his major works to do so. Aristotle had demonstrated the existence of a prime mover according to his principles of motion and substance. This led to a distinction between philosophical and theological truth and a manner of argumentation which tried to say both truths. So many thanks to you for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons, Sina Farzel, David Langness, Anthony Lee, Ian Palin, Johannes Rosenbaum, Steve Scholl, Ismail Valesco, Tobias Vetter, Tricia Williams, Jonah Winters, and Gloria Gazdani. You're very welcome to support my channel. Please do like, comment, and share if you will, and subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give links to my Patreon and PayPal accounts below if you want to provide practical support. Next week, we'll finish the chapter. Have a good day.